Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the smallest table in a crowded restaurant holds the biggest lesson about what it truly means to be rich. The warm glow of hanging lights spilled across polished wooden tables, while quiet conversations and the soft clink of silverware blended into the familiar rhythm of a busy Friday evening in downtown Chicago. Every booth seemed filled with families celebrating the end of another work week, couples sharing laughter over expensive steaks, and friends raising glasses to another successful month. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations disappeared weeks in advance, and every plate looked like it belonged in a magazine. 8-year-old Ethan Whitmore sat across from his father, swinging his feet beneath the leather booth as he carefully unfolded his napkin exactly the way his dad had taught him. Friday nights belonged to the two of them. No meetings, no investors, no business calls. Nolan Whitmore protected those dinners with the same determination he used to build one of the country's fastest-growing investment firms. To everyone else, he was a billionaire whose name appeared in financial magazines and business podcasts. To Ethan, he was simply Dad, the man who always let him order chocolate cake first before pretending to object. "Can I get the double chocolate one tonight?" Ethan asked with a hopeful grin. Nolan smiled without even opening the menu. "You ask every Friday." Ethan leaned forward. "And you always say yes." Nolan laughed softly. "That's because you already know the answer." Their waitress walked away after taking the order, leaving the two of them watching the restaurant fill with more guests escaping the cool fall evening outside. Nolan loosened his tie just enough to breathe easier. He rarely noticed the people around him anymore. Years of business dinners had trained him to focus only on the person sitting across the table. But tonight, someone else quietly entered his world. Just beyond Ethan's shoulder sat a young woman wearing a faded denim jacket over a simple sweater that had clearly been washed too many times. Her chestnut hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and although she wore a gentle smile, exhaustion rested beneath her eyes like she had not slept well in weeks. Across from her sat a little boy no older than 6, happily swinging his legs while staring at a single plate of creamy pasta placed exactly in the center of their small table. Nolan glanced away, assuming another meal would arrive. It never did. Instead, the woman carefully twirled a forkful of pasta and placed it onto the little boy's plate. "You take the big bites," she whispered with a smile that tried very hard to hide something. "Mom, you eat too," the little boy answered. "I'm not that hungry, sweetheart." She lied so naturally that almost no one would have noticed. Almost. Ethan stopped talking in the middle of reaching for his lemonade. His young eyes remained fixed on the family across the room. "Dad." Nolan looked up from the menu. "Yeah." Ethan pointed quietly without trying to be rude. "Why are they sharing one dinner?" Nolan followed his son's gaze. The woman smiled again, but this time she quietly pushed nearly 3/4 of the pasta toward her son before pretending to sip water. She never lifted her own fork. The little boy looked uncertain. "Mom, you sure?" "Absolutely," she said. "I had a late lunch." Another lie. Nolan recognized it immediately. Years ago, after his wife passed away, he had watched parents at hospital cafeterias make the exact same expression while insisting they were full so their children would eat first. It was the smile adults invented when life became harder than children should ever have to understand. Ethan lowered his voice. She didn't even order for herself. Nolan said nothing. Across the room, the little boy suddenly laughed at something only his mother could have said. She laughed too, brighter than before, making the entire restaurant believe everything was perfectly fine. But then Nolan noticed what no one else seemed to see. As the basket of complimentary bread arrived, she quietly wrapped one untouched dinner roll inside a folded white napkin and slipped it into her worn canvas bag when she thought nobody was looking. Not because she was embarrassed, because she was already thinking about tomorrow. Nolan quietly watched Claire fold the napkin over the dinner roll before slipping it into her bag with practiced care, and something inside him tightened in a way quarterly earnings reports and boardroom victories never could. He had seen expensive watches worth more than most family homes resting casually on wrists around this very restaurant. Yet none of those people looked half as wealthy as the little boy smiling across that tiny table. Ethan continued watching too, his young face filled not with curiosity anymore, but concern. "Dad?" he whispered. "Is she really not hungry?" Nolan looked at his son before answering. Sometimes parents tell their children they are full because they want to make sure their kids eat enough. Ethan frowned. "But she looks hungry." Nolan nodded slowly. "I think she probably is." Ethan stared at his own untouched breadbasket for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "Mom used to give me the biggest piece of pizza." Nolan felt the words settle heavily between them. "She did," he answered softly. "She always said she liked the crust better, but I do not think that was true." Ethan smiled faintly as another memory surfaced. "She was pretending too?" Nolan swallowed before replying. Sometimes love looks like pretending everything is okay. Across the room, Owen proudly lifted another forkful of pasta and laughed after accidentally dropping a noodle onto the table. Claire laughed with him immediately, brushing the noodle away as though nothing else in the world mattered. She never looked toward the neighboring tables. She never searched for sympathy. She simply made that single plate feel like the greatest dinner her son had ever seen. Nolan admired that. There was dignity in the way she protected her child from the weight she carried. There was also something painfully familiar about it. Years earlier, after losing his wife Emily to a sudden illness, Nolan had spent months trying to convince Ethan that everything would be all right even when he barely believed it himself. Money had never been the problem. Loneliness had. He remembered sitting beside Ethan in the enormous kitchen of their empty house, making grilled cheese sandwiches because neither of them had the energy to cook a proper meal. Ethan had smiled anyway because children measured love differently than adults did. They did not count dollars. They counted who stayed beside them. "Dad," Ethan interrupted his thoughts again. "Can we help them?" Nolan did not answer immediately. Helping someone financially was easy. Helping without taking away their pride required much greater care. He had learned that lesson from his own father long before success ever entered his life. His father used to say that the best kindness left room for gratitude, but never for embarrassment. Nolan looked back toward Claire. If a stranger suddenly offered cash in the middle of a crowded restaurant, she would almost certainly refuse. Her posture alone told him that much. She sat straight despite the worn jacket. She smiled despite the obvious exhaustion. She wanted her son to remember a pleasant dinner, not charity. The waitress arrived carrying Nolan and Ethan's meals, setting down a perfectly cooked steak beside roasted vegetables for Nolan and a cheeseburger with fries for Ethan. The rich aroma filled the booth. Ethan glanced from his overflowing plate back toward Owen's nearly empty one. Without saying another word, he slid his untouched basket of warm bread toward his father. Maybe they could have this. Nolan smiled gently. That is a kind thought. Ethan hesitated. But kindness works best when it lets people keep their pride. Ethan thought carefully about that answer. So we have to be smart kind? Nolan smiled wider than he had all evening. Exactly. At that moment, the restaurant manager walked past their table, greeting Nolan with the familiar respect reserved for regular patrons. Nolan quietly asked him to stop for just a second. He leaned closer and spoke in a calm voice that no one else could hear. The manager listened carefully, glanced toward Claire's table, then looked back with surprised eyes. Nolan simply nodded once. The manager smiled knowingly before disappearing toward the kitchen. Ethan looked up. "What did you do?" Nolan picked up his fork as though nothing unusual had happened. "I just asked someone to make sure tonight ends a little differently than it began." The restaurant manager returned to Claire's table carrying a polished dessert plate topped with a generous slice of warm chocolate cake, a scoop of vanilla ice cream slowly melting beside it, and 2 small spoons resting neatly on the edge. Claire looked up in confusion before politely shaking her head. "I think there has been a mistake," she said. "We did not order dessert." The manager smiled warmly. "There is no mistake, ma'am. Another guest wanted to make sure your evening ended with something sweet." Claire's expression changed immediately. She glanced around the dining room, her smile fading into quiet caution. "Please thank them," she replied gently, "but we cannot accept it." The manager had expected that answer. "May I ask why?" Claire rested one hand on Owen's shoulder before speaking. "Because I want my son to know that kindness is beautiful, but so is earning what we receive." Owen looked at the cake with wide, hopeful eyes, then looked back at his mother without saying a word. Nolan watched the exchange from across the room and admired her even more. She was not refusing because she was ungrateful. She was protecting something far more valuable than pride. She was protecting the example she set for her son every single day. Ethan quietly tugged on his father's sleeve. She said no. Nolan nodded. I thought she might. Ethan looked disappointed. So we cannot help? Nolan smiled thoughtfully. We just need a different way. He leaned closer to his son. Sometimes the best gift comes from another child. Ethan's eyes brightened immediately. Can I do it? Nolan nodded. Only if you do it because you want to. Ethan climbed carefully out of the booth, picked up the dessert plate with both hands while the manager steadied it, and slowly walked across the restaurant. Several nearby diners smiled as they watched the young boy approach another little boy with genuine excitement instead of awkwardness. Ethan stopped beside Owen's table. Hi, he said with a nervous smile. My name is Ethan. Owen smiled back instantly. I am Owen. Ethan looked down at the cake. I already had a really big dinner, and my dad says dessert tastes better when somebody shares it. Would you help me? Owen looked at his mother, silently asking permission. Claire studied Ethan's face. There was no pity there, no rehearsed speech, just a child hoping another child would say yes. She looked beyond him and finally noticed Nolan watching quietly from across the room. Their eyes met for the first time. He offered nothing more than a small, respectful nod. No grand gesture. No expectation. No introduction. Claire felt something soften inside her. It would be very kind to help him, she told Owen. Owen grinned. Then yes. Ethan carefully placed the dessert on the table before climbing into the empty chair beside Owen, as though they had known each other for months instead of seconds. Within moments they were laughing over whose scoop of ice cream was bigger. Claire watched the two boys talk about baseball cards, dinosaurs, and school projects with the effortless friendship only children seemed able to create. Nolan remained where he was, giving them space. After a minute, Claire stood and slowly walked toward his table. Was this your idea? She asked quietly. Nolan smiled. The cake was mine. Sending my son over was his. Claire looked back at the boys before returning her eyes to Nolan. Thank you. You found a way to help without making my son feel different. Nolan shook his head gently. I only gave them an excuse to become friends. Claire smiled for the first time without forcing it. That is rarer than you think. Before Nolan could answer, Owen hurried over holding a folded sheet of paper covered with colorful crayon drawings. Mom, look. The picture showed two boys standing beside an enormous slice of cake with bright smiling faces. In one corner, Owen had carefully drawn a tiny dinner plate with almost nothing left on it. I always draw the best part of my day, Owen explained proudly. Nolan studied the drawing for a brief moment, unaware that the little sketch of one nearly empty plate would remain in his memory long after every expensive meal he had ever eaten had been forgotten. Claire carefully folded Owen's drawing and tucked it inside the same worn canvas bag that already held the dinner roll wrapped in a white napkin. She thanked Ethan once more, smiled politely at Nolan, and returned to her table before quietly asking for the check. Nolan noticed that she counted every dollar before placing the bills inside the small leather folder, smoothing each one with deliberate care as though respecting the effort it had taken to earn them. When she and Owen finally stood to leave, Owen waved enthusiastically across the restaurant. Bye, Ethan. Maybe we will share cake again someday. Ethan laughed and waved both hands. Next time we can have 2 slices. Claire smiled at that innocent promise before leading her son toward the front door, disappearing into the cool Chicago evening. Nolan remained seated for several quiet moments after they left. His steak had gone cold, yet he barely remembered eating it. Ethan looked toward the entrance long after the door had closed behind their new friends. Do you think we will ever see them again? He asked. Nolan picked up his water glass before answering honestly. I do not know. Ethan rested his chin on his hands. I hope we do. Owen is funny. Nolan smiled. I think he would say the same about you. The drive home was quieter than most Friday nights. The city lights reflected across the windshield while soft music played through the speakers. Ethan eventually fell asleep in the passenger seat, still clutching the paper restaurant placemat where he and Owen had started drawing dinosaurs together while waiting for dessert. Nolan glanced at the simple sketch every time they stopped at a traffic light. It reminded him that meaningful moments rarely arrived wrapped in expensive packaging. Sometimes they arrived with crayons and melted ice cream. The following Saturday morning began with sunshine pouring through the tall windows of Nolan's home, but the house still carried the same quiet that had settled there years ago. It was beautiful, spacious, and meticulously designed. Yet there were mornings when it felt far too large for only two people. Ethan sat at the kitchen island eating pancakes while talking nonstop about dinosaurs, baseball, and whether Owen would like the science museum. Maybe we could invite him someday, Ethan suggested between bites. Nolan poured orange juice into his son's glass. If we happen to meet again, maybe. Ethan accepted the answer with a nod before rushing upstairs to get dressed for baseball practice. Later that afternoon, after practice ended, Nolan decided to stop at the neighborhood public library so Ethan could return a stack of books he had finished during the week. It was a place they visited often because Ethan loved reading almost as much as he loved asking questions. The library smelled of old pages, polished wood, and fresh coffee drifting from the small cafe near the entrance. Ethan hurried toward the children's section while Nolan wandered through the history shelves, enjoying the peaceful silence that seemed impossible to find anywhere else. Then he heard a familiar laugh. It was soft, warm, and instantly recognizable. He looked toward the reading corner and saw Owen sitting at a small table surrounded by colored pencils, carefully shading the branches of a large oak tree on another drawing. Across from him sat Claire, helping him sound out difficult words from a library book while occasionally brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She looked different in daylight. There was still fatigue around her eyes, but there was also patience, kindness, and quiet determination. She wore the same denim jacket, now with one sleeve neatly stitched where it had once torn. Owen looked up first, his face lit with immediate excitement. "Mom, that is Ethan." Claire followed his gaze and seemed genuinely surprised. Before she could say anything, Ethan came running around the bookshelf with two library books tucked beneath one arm. He stopped so suddenly that he almost dropped them. "Owen!" Owen jumped out of his chair. "You came." The two boys smiled as though only a single day had passed instead of an entire week. Claire looked at Nolan and laughed softly. "I suppose they answered your son's question before either of us could." Nolan smiled back. "It seems they did. Maybe Chicago is smaller than we thought." Claire shook her head with an amused smile. "Or maybe life has a strange way of introducing the same people twice." The boys settled onto the colorful carpet in the children's reading corner as if they had been classmates for years instead of strangers who had shared one dessert only a week earlier. Ethan immediately opened one of his dinosaur books while Owen proudly spread out his newest drawing, explaining every tiny detail with animated excitement. Claire watched them with quiet relief. Children rarely cared about backgrounds, neighborhoods, or bank accounts. They simply decided whether someone was kind, and if the answer was yes, friendship followed naturally. Nolan leaned against a nearby bookshelf with a small smile. "They make it look easy," he said. Claire looked up from the book in her hands. "Children usually do." She closed the novel gently before continuing. "Adults spend too much time wondering who belongs where." Nolan nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we forget that everyone is looking for the same things." Claire smiled. "A safe place, someone who listens, and enough hope to get through tomorrow." Her words lingered between them longer than either expected. They moved to a small table near the library cafe while the boys remained within sight, completely absorbed in building imaginary worlds with books and colored pencils. Nolan ordered 2 coffees without asking what Claire preferred. When the barista called his name, he returned carrying 1 regular black coffee and 1 hot tea. Claire looked surprised. "How did you know I drink tea?" Nolan laughed quietly. "I did not. I guess coffee might remind you too much of another long workday." Claire accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "Good guess." They talked easily, avoiding subjects that felt too personal. Claire mentioned that she worked several part-time jobs with changing schedules. Some mornings she stocked shelves before sunrise. Other afternoons, she handled customer service calls from home while Owen was at school. Nolan simply said that he worked in finance and spent more time in meetings than he wanted. He never mentioned Whitmore Capital. He never mentioned magazine covers or billion-dollar acquisitions. Claire appreciated that. There was something refreshing about a man who seemed more interested in asking questions than answering them. She noticed the way he listened carefully before speaking, never interrupting, never checking his phone, never looking distracted. It reminded her of a quality that had become surprisingly rare: presence. As the afternoon drifted by, Ethan and Owen invited their parents outside to the small park beside the library. Autumn leaves covered the walking paths in shades of gold and amber, while families enjoyed the unusually warm weather. The boys raced toward the playground before stopping beneath a massive oak tree whose branches stretched across nearly half the park. Owen reached into his backpack and carefully removed the drawing he had made after the restaurant dinner. "I want to finish it," he announced. Sitting cross-legged beneath the tree, he added another picture beside the slice of cake. This time he drew 4 smiling figures standing together beneath broad green branches. Ethan pointed excitedly. "That one is me." Owen nodded proudly. "And that is my mom. That is your dad." Nolan watched quietly as Owen concentrated on every line with remarkable patience. Claire smiled. "He has always loved drawing. He says pictures help him remember happy days." Nolan looked at the growing illustration before saying softly, "He has a gift." Claire laughed gently. "He says every picture tells the truth, even when people do not." Nolan found himself looking at Claire instead of the drawing. She spoke with calm honesty, never asking for sympathy despite the obvious challenges she faced. The denim jacket was still carefully mended. Her shoes showed signs of long days on hard sidewalks. Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity that no expensive designer label could imitate. As the sun began lowering behind the trees, Claire checked the time on her inexpensive wristwatch. The smile faded almost imperceptibly. "We should probably go." Owen looked disappointed. "Already? I have another shift tonight." She tried to sound cheerful, but the exhaustion in her voice quietly escaped. Nolan pretended not to notice, respecting the boundary she clearly wished to keep. Ethan hugged Owen before the two boys promised to meet again at the library the following Saturday. Claire thanked Nolan for the pleasant afternoon, then reached into her bag to gather Owen's things. As she zipped it closed, Nolan noticed the same carefully folded white napkin still resting inside beside Owen's drawing. She had not eaten the dinner roll that night. She had saved it. Somehow that small detail stayed with him long after he watched Claire and Owen disappear down the sidewalk, because he realized the napkin no longer represented a piece of bread. It represented a mother who refused to waste even the smallest blessing while quietly carrying burdens she had never spoken aloud. Over the next several weeks, Saturday afternoons quietly became something all 4 of them looked forward to without ever admitting it aloud. Sometimes they met at the library, where Ethan and Owen challenged each other to find the most interesting books on dinosaurs, space, or famous inventors. Other weekends they wandered through neighborhood farmers markets, sharing fresh apple cider while the boys raced from one booth to another collecting free stickers and tiny pumpkins. Nolan found himself laughing more often than he had in years. Claire noticed it too. The serious man she had first met across a restaurant now smiled easily whenever Ethan proudly explained another impossible science fact, or when Owen insisted that every squirrel in Chicago secretly belonged to the same family. One crisp Saturday morning, they visited a community art fair held in a renovated warehouse filled with local painters, photographers, and sculptors. Owen stopped in front of nearly every display, studying each piece with remarkable patience before asking thoughtful questions that surprised many of the artists. Claire apologized repeatedly for his endless curiosity, but every artist simply smiled and encouraged him to ask another question. Nolan watched quietly as Claire knelt beside her son, explaining how different colors could make people feel hopeful, peaceful, or brave. It was obvious she knew far more about art than she ever admitted. "You speak like someone who studied this," Nolan observed. Claire looked at one of the watercolor landscapes before answering. "I wanted to." She smiled softly. Life had different plans. She did not elaborate, and Nolan respected the silence. Later that afternoon, while the boys participated in a children's drawing activity, Nolan wandered through the exhibition with Claire. They paused in front of a painting showing an old wooden table surrounded by empty chairs waiting for family members to return home. Claire stared at it for several quiet moments. "Beautiful," she whispered. "It reminds me that sometimes the people missing from the table matter just as much as the people sitting there." Nolan understood immediately. "My wife loved hosting family dinners," he said gently. "The house still feels strange without her." Claire turned toward him with genuine compassion. "I am sorry." Nolan nodded. "It has been 5 years, but Ethan still leaves one extra cookie on the plate every Christmas Eve." Claire smiled sadly. Children remember love in ways adults never stop discovering. She almost spoke again before stopping herself. Nolan noticed the hesitation, but did not press. He had learned that trust grew best when given room to breathe. As the afternoon ended, the boys proudly presented their finished drawings. Ethan had sketched a rocket launching into the stars. Owen held up another carefully colored picture beneath the familiar oak tree from the park. This time the drawing showed 4 people sitting around a picnic blanket, each with their own full plate of food. Nolan looked at the picture for a long moment before asking, "Everyone has their own dinner this time?" Owen nodded with complete sincerity. Nobody has to pretend they are already full. The simple sentence settled quietly over the group. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief second before smiling at her son. "That is a very nice picture." Owen folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his backpack beside the earlier restaurant drawing. As they walked toward the parking lot, Claire's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time all afternoon, the warmth disappeared from her face. She stepped a few feet away before answering in a calm voice. "Hello. Yes, I understand. I know the rent is overdue. I just need a little more time. Please, I am trying." Nolan could not hear every word, but he did not need to. Claire thanked the caller, ended the conversation, and stood silently for several seconds before forcing the familiar, reassuring smile back onto her face. When she returned, Owen immediately reached for her hand. "Everything okay, Mom?" Claire squeezed his fingers gently. "Everything will be okay." Nolan recognized that sentence. It was the same promise parents made when they were carrying worries too heavy for small shoulders. He chose not to ask questions. Instead, he simply offered, "Next Saturday the city is hosting a family festival by the lake. Ethan has been asking if Owen might like to come." Claire hesitated only briefly before smiling. "I think we would like that very much." As they walked toward their separate cars, Nolan noticed Claire glance almost instinctively toward the small apartment building visible across the street, and although she quickly looked away, he could not ignore the quiet uncertainty that lingered in her eyes, leaving him with the unmistakable feeling that the hardest part of her story had not yet been told. The following Saturday arrived with bright blue skies stretching over Lake Michigan, and the family festival filled the waterfront with music, colorful tents, and the cheerful sounds of children chasing one another across the grass. Ethan and Owen disappeared almost immediately into a maze of games, laughing as they competed to see who could throw a beanbag the farthest or solve a giant wooden puzzle first. Nolan and Claire followed at a slower pace, enjoying the rare comfort of walking beside someone who no longer felt like a stranger. They talked about favorite books, childhood memories, and the small routines that quietly held families together. Claire admitted that every Sunday morning she and Owen made pancakes shaped like different animals, even when they only had enough batter for 2 small servings. Nolan smiled and confessed that Ethan insisted on naming every houseplant in their kitchen because he believed plants grew faster when someone talked to them. For the first time in years, ordinary conversation felt more valuable to Nolan than any negotiation he had attended. As they reached a booth where local artists displayed children's paintings, Owen tugged excitedly on Claire's sleeve. "Mom, they have a family art contest." Claire looked at the sign. Every participating child would receive a small canvas and could paint anything that represented home. Ethan immediately grabbed 2 blank canvases and handed one to Owen. The boys settled onto folding stools while volunteers distributed brushes and bright acrylic paints. Nolan and Claire stood nearby, watching in comfortable silence. After nearly 30 minutes, the children proudly revealed their work. Ethan had painted a large tree house with 4 smiling figures standing beneath it. Owen's painting was quieter. It showed a small kitchen table with 4 chairs. Every chair was occupied, and every person had a full dinner plate in front of them. In the middle of the table sat a basket holding fresh bread. Claire stared at the painting without speaking. Nolan quietly noticed one tiny detail hidden in the corner. Folded beside the basket was a carefully drawn white napkin, the same white napkin that had carried a single dinner roll weeks earlier. Before either adult could say anything, the festival announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to welcome today's special guest and sponsor, the founder of Whitmore Capital and the Whitmore Foundation, Mr. Nolan Whitmore." Claire blinked once, convinced she had misheard. Around them, people began turning toward the main stage. Business owners, volunteers, and city officials applauded as photographers gathered near the podium. Ethan smiled proudly. "Dad, they are calling you." Nolan let out a quiet breath he had hoped not to take that day. He looked toward Claire, whose expression had shifted from confusion to complete disbelief. She stared at him as though seeing an entirely different person standing in the same place. Nolan spoke gently. "Claire, I can explain." But the announcer continued. "Please, welcome one of Chicago's leading philanthropists and entrepreneurs." The applause grew louder. Ethan took his father's hand without hesitation and led him toward the stage. Nolan looked back one last time before stepping forward. Claire remained frozen beside Owen's painting, barely hearing the applause around her. Every conversation they had shared over coffee, every walk through the park, every afternoon in the library replayed in her mind. He had told her he worked in finance. That had been true. He simply had never told her the whole truth. From the stage, Nolan accepted the microphone, but found himself looking only toward Claire, standing quietly in the crowd. He barely noticed the cameras pointed in his direction. Instead of speaking about investments or charitable programs, he smiled faintly and said, "The greatest lessons about generosity do not happen in boardrooms. They happen when ordinary people choose kindness even on the hardest days of their lives." Claire felt her heart tighten. Somehow she knew those words were about her, and that realization only made everything more complicated. She lowered her eyes, reached for Owen's hand, and quietly folded his painting before slipping it into her bag beside the earlier drawing and the carefully saved white napkin. Without waiting for the ceremony to end, she turned and walked slowly away from the festival. Owen glanced back toward Ethan with a small wave of apology before following his mother. From the stage, Nolan watched them disappear into the crowd, realizing that the one truth he had chosen not to reveal might become the very reason he lost the people who had begun to make his world feel like home again. Claire did not answer Nolan's calls that evening. She did not reply to his messages the next morning either. She was not angry because he was wealthy. She was hurt because somewhere between library visits, shared coffee, and afternoons watching their sons laugh together, she had begun believing she knew the man behind the quiet smile. Now she questioned every conversation they had ever shared. Had he been studying her? Testing her? Feeling sorry for her from the very beginning? Sitting at the tiny kitchen table inside their apartment after Owen had fallen asleep, Claire carefully removed 3 things from her canvas bag and placed them side by side. The folded white napkin that had once wrapped a single dinner roll, Owen's drawing of the chocolate cake, and the newest painting of 4 people sitting around one table with full dinner plates. She stared at them for a long time before whispering to herself, what was real? Across the city, Nolan sat alone in his office long after every employee had gone home. The lights of Chicago stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed them. His desk was covered with reports waiting for approval, acquisition proposals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and invitations to charity galas. None of them mattered tonight. Ethan quietly walked into the office carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He placed one beside his father before climbing into the chair across from him. "She is mad," Ethan said softly. Nolan nodded. "She has every right to be." Ethan thought for a moment. "You did not lie." Nolan looked down at his hands. "I did not tell the whole truth either." Ethan sipped his drink before asking the question only a child would think to ask. "If you met her before you had money, would you still have helped her?" Nolan answered without hesitation. "Of course. Then maybe you need to help more people like her." The simple sentence lingered in the quiet office. Nolan slowly looked toward the large framed photograph hanging on the wall behind his desk. It showed the opening ceremony of the Whitmore Foundation years earlier. The foundation had funded scholarships, hospitals, and educational programs across the country. Yet suddenly all of it felt strangely distant from the quiet struggle he had witnessed over a single dinner plate. Early Monday morning, Nolan canceled 3 executive meetings and gathered the leadership team of his charitable foundation instead. The room filled with directors expecting another discussion about annual budgets. Instead, Nolan placed a simple sketch in the center of the conference table. It was Owen's drawing of 4 people sharing dinner beneath an oak tree. Beside it, he carefully unfolded the white napkin he had quietly asked the restaurant manager to save after that first evening. Every executive looked confused. Nolan spoke calmly. "I want to start a new initiative." He paused before continuing. "Not another scholarship. Not another building." He gently touched the folded napkin. "I want to make sure no working parent has to pretend they are already full so their child can eat." Silence filled the room. Then one director quietly asked, "What would we call it?" Nolan looked again at the drawing. One plate project. Over the following weeks, teams worked across the city designing a community program unlike anything the foundation had created before. Local restaurants volunteered surplus meals. Neighborhood grocery stores donated fresh food. Family resource centers offered evening dinners where parents and children could sit together with dignity instead of standing in long lines. Every location featured ordinary dining tables because Nolan insisted that people deserved more than food. They deserved the feeling of belonging around a table. There were no giant photographs of donors, no banners celebrating wealthy sponsors, and no speeches praising generosity. Only a small sign near each entrance carried a simple drawing of one dinner plate beside the words, "Everyone deserves a seat at the table." Claire first heard about the project while stocking shelves during an early morning shift. Two co-workers were discussing a new family program opening downtown. She barely paid attention until one of them mentioned the name Whitmore Foundation. She stopped placing canned soup onto the shelf and quietly listened. That evening, after picking Owen up from school, she passed one of the newly opened community dining spaces on her way home. Through the large front windows, she saw families laughing together over warm meals. Near the entrance hung a framed illustration that immediately caught her breath. It was not a company logo. It was a child's drawing of four people sitting around one table, every plate full, with a tiny folded white napkin resting beside a basket of bread. Claire stood motionless outside the community dining space, her hand resting lightly against the glass as families inside shared warm meals, quiet conversations, and unhurried laughter. Nobody looked embarrassed. Nobody looked as though they had to prove they deserved to be there. Children carried their own trays while parents smiled without the invisible weight she knew so well. Her eyes returned to the framed drawing near the entrance. Owen recognized it instantly. "Mom," he whispered, tugging gently on her sleeve. "That is my picture." Claire nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart, it is." Beneath the drawing was a small plaque that read, "Inspired by one ordinary family dinner that reminded us everyone deserves a place at the table." Claire felt tears gather for the first time in years, not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had transformed a private moment of dignity into hope for thousands of strangers without ever revealing her name. A volunteer welcomed them inside with the same warmth offered to every guest. There were no questions about income, no forms to complete before sitting down, no special treatment. Just a table waiting for them. Owen smiled as he carried 2 trays to an empty table near the window. Before Claire could sit down, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I was hoping you would come someday." She turned slowly. Nolan stood a few feet away wearing a simple navy sweater instead of a business suit. There were no photographers, no executives, and no reporters. Ethan stood beside him holding a carefully folded piece of paper with both hands. For a long moment, neither adult spoke. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "You built all of this." Nolan shook his head gently. "No. I only listened." He looked toward the framed drawing on the wall. The idea belonged to a little boy who believed everyone should have their own plate. Owen and Ethan immediately reunited as though no time had passed, happily talking about school projects and baseball, while leaving the adults a quiet moment of their own. Claire looked back at Nolan. "Why did you never tell anyone where the idea came from?" Nolan smiled softly. "Because it was never about my story. It was about yours, and I promised myself I would never take away your dignity to celebrate my generosity." Claire lowered her eyes, remembering every conversation she had questioned after learning who he really was. "I thought you pitied me." Nolan answered without hesitation. "Claire, I admired you from the first night I saw you smiling across one dinner plate. You taught your son kindness without teaching him shame. That is something money cannot buy." Claire felt the wall around her heart begin to disappear. "I should have listened instead of assuming the worst." Nolan smiled. "I should have trusted you with the truth sooner." Ethan stepped forward and handed Nolan the folded paper he had been carrying. Nolan carefully opened it. Inside was Owen's very first drawing from the restaurant, the one showing 2 boys sharing chocolate cake beside a nearly empty dinner plate. "Owen wanted you to have it," Ethan explained. Nolan accepted the drawing as though it were the most valuable gift he had ever received. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded another familiar keepsake. The carefully pressed white napkin from that first evening, preserved inside a clear protective sleeve. He placed it gently beside Owen's drawing on the table. These two things changed my life, he said quietly. One reminded me that love sometimes hides behind sacrifice. The other reminded me that hope begins when someone chooses to share. Claire smiled through grateful tears. You kept it. I always will. 1 year later, the One Plate project had expanded across dozens of communities, serving families with dignity and creating places where no parent needed to hide an empty stomach behind a reassuring smile. Claire accepted Nolan's invitation to help lead the program, bringing her compassion and first-hand understanding to every decision they made. Together, they focused not only on meals, but also on creating spaces where families could reconnect around ordinary tables. On the anniversary of the restaurant dinner, Nolan invited Claire, Ethan, and Owen back to the same booth, where everything had quietly begun. This time, 4 full plates rested on the table. A basket of fresh bread sat in the center beside a neatly folded white napkin. Nolan reached across the table and gently took Claire's hand. The first night we met, he said softly, I thought I was watching a mother protect her son. I never imagined I was also watching the woman who would teach me what real wealth looks like. Claire smiled as Ethan and Owen exchanged knowing grins across the table. And what does real wealth look like? She asked. Nolan looked at the people surrounding him before answering. It looks like never having to eat alone. It looks like making sure there is always one more chair, one more plate, and one more chance for someone to feel like they belong. Outside, the city continued rushing through another ordinary evening, but inside that small restaurant booth, for hearts had become one family, and for the first time, nobody had to pretend they were already full. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.